Thank you very much, Henry, and welcome to all of you guinea pigs. There's life beyond Zoom, and that's wonderful. So I'm very, very happy to chair this wonderful panel, and thank you also to Julia and Antonio and everybody else who's helping to set this up, and thank you to Julia for bringing this together, this panel. The topic is the polarization trap and how to avoid it, and maybe even how to get out of it once you're trapped. And as Henry mentioned, it's quite a topical theme. I think 10 years ago in Germany, we wouldn't have had this. We would have had a discussion more on asymmetric demobilization and the efforts of our chancellor to make sure that things don't get too contentious and that political debates don't really emerge, and that everybody somehow stays in the mainstream and votes for, you know, what is the safe option. Things have changed, and I think things have changed in Germany. And we can learn from other countries who've already gone, who are in a different stage of this polarization cycle. And that's why this wonderful panel, I think, will be able to enlighten us on this. Just by way of introduction, it's important to say that we don't think, and that's not the assumption of the panel, that polarization per se is bad. I think asymmetric demobilization can be very bad, and the delusion that a third way somehow is the end of history and ends all debates on what the right political model is or what social rules we need. What we're concerned with on this panel is what Zsuzsanna called toxic polarization, that if it goes so far that you don't no longer respect you don't want to listen to the other side, you don't see the other side as a legitimate part of the discussion, that you think you need to do everything to avoid that side getting power again, and you stuff the judiciary, and you do everything that it's no longer possible for others to have a voice and to make their voice heard. Plus, it also sucks the air out of productive discussions on the kind of economic model we need, what we need to do about climate change, what we need to do about social equality and racial issues in society. If everything's toxically polarized, it's impossible to come to a productive discussion on this. And today we want to take stock of what polarization means in some societies, how we got into it, and what we can do to get out of it. We'll start, and I'll introduce the wonderful panel. We'll start with Susanna Cellini, who is a Bosch fellow, a Weizsäcker fellow here at the Robert Bosch Academy right now, but who has a fascinating personal and professional history on that kind of on this topic. She's a psychologist or studied psychology, which I think is already a good start on this topic. And then from 1989 to 1994, she was a member of Fidesz, which is the party that's now known for being the party of Hungary's right-wing premier, Mr. Orban, but back then was a liberal party, and then you went through a succession of political parties in Hungary. You left Fidesz because it was no longer liberal, sticking to liberal values, and were a politician with other liberal forces, a member of parliament, and you experienced what it means for a society to get into this polarization cycle firsthand, and we're excited to have you. Then Natalie Nougayrède, she's also a Richard von Weizsäcker fellow here at the Bosch Academy. and a columnist with The Guardian, and one of the best-known French, I can say, international journalists. She was a journalist with Le Monde and became also the first, I don't know what the best English translation is, managing and executive editor of Le Monde. Then left Le Monde after disagreements on where the paper should go, and became a columnist, an editorial board member with The Guardian, and you'll read her writing on international affairs quite frequently if you follow current events. So it's wonderful to have you as well on this, and focusing especially on the role that media play in polarization and toxic polarization, and what media can do to get us to avoid it and get us out of it. And Laura Krause, she's the head of More in Common Deutschland, and full disclosure, I'm on the board of More in Common, on the global board of More in Common, so I'm a little partisan that this is a great organization, and that Laura is a wonderful voice on these issues. She worked in politics a little bit, working on the European election campaign of Martin Schulz back then. Then was also a strategy consultant. Then led the Future of Democracy work at Progressives Zentrum here in Berlin, before becoming the founding director of More in Common Germany. And More in Common is an organization that asks that question. What is this polarization all about, and how can we get out of it, and how can we kind of come to a bigger we again in our societies? And More in Common, besides Germany, works in France, the UK, and the US, and Laura will draw on some insights on the work in these countries as well. So welcome. It's exciting to have you all, and why don't you kick us off with your reflections on the Hungarian experience, on how we got into this cycle of toxic polarization, and what we can learn from it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very welcome all of you here today. Very excited that at this very first, probably first in Berlin meeting, we can have in live, and we can meet in live. So let me tell you a little story on Hungary. Hungarians, one of the most important national holiday in Hungary is the 15th of March. This is a anniversary of the 1848 revolution, which all our European countries had, the bourgeois revolution. This is something that all Hungarians agreed that this is a great historic moment. So on that day, on the 15th of March, Hungarians usually wear a cockade. This is a ribbon, a flower-shaped ribbon, which we use as a badge, from the national tricolor. This comes from, I think, from the French originally. So this is something Hungarians wearing for like 150 years on that day. So in 2002, Viktor Orbán was prime minister in Hungary, and we were facing an election. And the election happened to be 2 weeks after 15th of March. So obviously 15th of March was used by all political forces for campaigning. So on that day, Orbán made a rally and gave a big speech, and he said that everyone who wants to Fidesz to repeat its power, to come to be voted to make a success, should wear the cockade until the election day. So basically for the next following 2 weeks. So this, I mean, just put yourself into the shoes of someone who did not want to vote for Orbán. So do you keep it on because you believe you are a proper Hungarian national, or you take it off because you don't want to look like Orbán's supporter, But of course, so it was a very, very confusing moment for many people. So, and this was a obviously visible divide, not only in the political forces, but basically the following days. I remember my kids were very small that time, so I went to the nursery, Akita, right? And yes. Then half of the parents had the badge or the cockade, and the other half didn't have. And these were very confusing because I was really not interested in who was my kids' parents do vote for. So this was a fascinating campaign, and actually did not work out. Orbán lost the election. In 2002, a nationalist mobilization was not possible in Europe, even in Central Europe. The time were just all Hungarians, we were just moving towards the European Union. Fidesz joined the EPP that year. So it was so brutal that it was actually counter-efficient. So Orbán lost the election in 2002, just with a margin. And however, he continued this mobilization. He made a big rally a couple of weeks after the election, and he made a speech, and this very notable phrase he used, we can't be in opposition because the nation cannot be in opposition. So basically, he was moving on, appropriating that he is the one who is representing the people, the nation, the ones who got to power are not legitimate people. And ever since then, he put his mark on this. So for certain reasons, he lost elections 4 years later in 2006. But then when the socialist government, there was a leak when the prime minister was heard saying that we were lying in the campaign that was leaked. Then Fidesz started a huge street mobilization. Orbán basically boycotted the parliament. However, he was a big opposition party in parliament. He did not participate, but he gathered masses in the street. He was speaking all the time on the street. And then the Socialist Party leader was very strongly reciprocating this action. So he also mobilized his voters, like saying that Fidesz is a Nazi organization, so that within a few years, by 2007, the country was in a democratic dysfunction. We are in 2007. And big blocks of people are hanging around. They hate each other. They believe the other one is immoral. They are not representing properly the people. So that was a very, very critical phase. And then we got the 2008 crisis, a big moment when a crisis played its role, and then the government collapsed, and Fidesz got this landslide victory in 2010. So, and then, you know, ever since, what is a different story. It's majoritarianism, it's one-party dominance, it's autocratization. So why is it important in our discussion today? I think it demonstrates everything what we should know, how toxic polarization is evolving. It's a process, it's politically motivated, there's always political leadership, it's always kind of binary, us and them. This is a kind of enemy, it's a zero-sum game. There is also a very strong affective dimension, so it's very emotional. There are seductive political simplicity on each block, and then this completely impossible and incapable to discuss anything with each other. And if it's reciprocated, then it creates a democratic dysfunction. So this is how everything started in Hungary. And this is how the country has changed within 10 years in a completely different format. So I'm saying this because this was 15 years ago. And now, after the third crisis of the 2008 crisis and 2015, the migration crisis, and now we again have our own contemporary crisis, these are all a flashing point when things can really change very easily, very quickly. Underlying processes can create a different shape. So I think we should be aware of this.
Thank you very much, for presenting the history of the Orban polarization in Hungary, and it's a cautionary tale in terms of how quickly things can change from 2003 and to 2007 when this happened. Natalie, on the many say that the media play an important role in polarization. What's your thinking on this?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Hi. This is the first time I'm in the same room with so many people in 4 months. So it's just amazing. Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me. I came back to Berlin last week after lockdown in Paris for 3 months. Anyway, I'm sure everybody has an amazing personal story about these months we're going through. So it's good to exercise our brains differerly and think about polarization and not just about, indeed, lockdowns and confinements. And when I was trying to think about this discussion, I thought that it was worth, before I perhaps share some thoughts on things that I've experienced as a journalist or thoughts on journalism and the media, just to dwell a little bit on how we exactly define polarization. And in my mind, and this is a discussion probably in itself, and I well took note of the expression toxic polarization. And in my mind, polarization is a situation where the different sides can no longer even talk with each other. That's for me a situation of polarization. The level of hostility, of disagreement is such that there is no common discussion possible. And if you have a situation like that, then that means you cannot have deliberation. You cannot have deliberation. And if you cannot have deliberation, you cannot have the processes of building compromise which define democracy. So for me, polarization, toxic polarization, is the negation of even the possibility of having a democratic process, because you cannot have, if you only have polarization, you cannot have deliberation. You're not having that process of compromise building, which is the foundation of democracy since the ancient Greeks, right? So that's the first thing. Another thought that I have is it seems to me we live in a world of opinion. And again, if I were more logical about Greek philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, I would probably say something intelligent about opinion. But we live in a world of opinion. Everybody can produce opinion. We have the technology to spread our opinion. So this is the technological, media, societal world we live in. And we've reached a point where, of course we are entitled to our opinion, but we have started equating our personal opinion with our being. That what I believe is what I am. Like, I am defined by what I believe, by my opinion. I am defined by my opinion. Everything about me is in my opinion. And when you start thinking like that, it means that if somebody disagrees with you, that person is negating you. This is the dangerous thing we're in, I think. That I'm so defined by my opinion that if somebody disagrees with my opinion, then that is like an attack on my person. It's like my existence is being put in doubt. And this is I think part of the world we're in as well. And another level which I find worrying. I'm not going to be producing many answers right now. I'm just giving you my flashpoints, like the things that worry me when I think about this question of polarization. The other element is again the dangerous situation we are in. My legitimacy as an individual to speak is defined by who and what I am. This is a dangerous thing. My legitimacy to even speak about something is defined by perhaps my skin color, by my social origin, by my activity. My freedom to be heard and my legitimacy to speak is contained and defined by something which is almost like it can be even in my genes. So, and this is a dangerous thing we are in as well. I see this. I see this thing happening as well. And of course, we can ask the question of what the media's role is. But I'll stop there for now. But my little interrogation is the media really responsible for all of that? Is there not something deeper happening?
Thank you. Laura, maybe you want to share a few insights from More in Common's work in these 4 countries and in Germany in particular on how polarization looks like, and maybe also start thinking about, or we'll do that in a second round, how we can avoid it and get out of it.
I can try that. So yeah, also thank you from me and also for showing up for this. Also my first in-person event, and it's really strange when you work for an organization whose mission it is to bring people together in a society. We've been writing some grant applications during the lockdown, which, as you all know, was not a full lockdown in Germany, and it was really strange to write about convening and connection when everybody is at home, because we believe that that is actually really important to what we're discussing. And Thorsten mentioned that More in Common works in 4 countries, and I think I'm mentioning this because I think it's useful for our discussion, because it's part of the setup that I really appreciate about my organization, is because we work in those 4 Western democracies that were mentioned, France, UK, the US and Germany, and we work on similar challenges, and the challenge of polarization is true for all of our countries, but of course, there are different circumstances in our countries. The fabric of our countries is different. And I feel like that almost comes out more in our work, because we need to explain our countries on a regular basis, almost weekly, to our colleagues. And especially from a German perspective, setting up our work here in the past 2 years, it really feels that we are profiting a lot from sort of the sad circumstances that a lot of the countries my colleagues work in are actually further ahead down the polarization, or further into the trap already. And I often say that Germany feels a little behind the curve. And I do feel that there is a lot of complacency, though, still in Germany, that we don't really use this time advantage that we have to make sure that we don't tap into the same traps as much. So how we try to tackle this is to really do, and so I appreciated a lot what you said about opinion, to sort of dig deeper beyond the opinions into the values and the core beliefs that drive people apart, and to really understand how people's perspective of society change fundamentally. Because I feel that in Germany, a lot of people still believe that polarization happens because we disagree on issues, but it actually goes a lot deeper. So we do that through research, but really through that lens of trying to see where we can bridge divides and where you can find the common ground. And in terms of avoiding the trap, I think so I will try to offer a few thoughts to kick us off. And I think one way to avoid the trap is to really try to look at the specific problem. It's not a one-size-fits-all, unfortunately. The circumstances are different in societies, but we need to learn from one another. And so, for example, my colleagues are right now, they've been in the field doing research in the UK, and they actually found that beyond Brexit, there is not so much polarization on the issues in the UK. It's really more a fragmentation of society, and that people live in very different worlds of how they look at the country, but it's actually not the polarization that we would like to, that we all like to believe there is. And so I do have some thoughts about the media, about why we try to believe these things, and I actually often feel that in my own country, we do often get the impression of us versus them. Certainly when I open Twitter, which I do way too often, I do get that impression, and it's really one of the puzzles I'm trying to think about, because I feel like our brain is wired in a way to try to look at the world that way, because maybe it's more, it's easier. And what we're discussing here as toxic polarization is something that Jonathan Haidt, a moral psychologist that has really informed our work a lot, he calls it effective polarization. And sort of this deep disregard of people who disagree with me that we see in the United States, that people don't want to work in the same office with people who vote Republican or Democratic, that people don't want their children to marry somebody who's from the other side. We don't have that in Germany yet, but I see glimpses of that when people just, I don't know, just effectively react to something that somebody from the CSU said and they're in the Green Party. And so I feel like being really aware of these mechanisms and of our reflexes for me is one of the first things to try to not get into the trap. And in order to get out of the trap, I almost would say we have to go down to really basic humanity and trust in between people. So actually the issue of trust is one that is kind of slowly moving more to the center of what we're trying to do at More in Common, certainly in Germany. And I will stop there because we see that sort of the eroding trust between people, that people say other people are selfish and that society just has a rougher tone in general, that things got quicker and quicker, is something we heard in focus groups a lot last year in Germany. But also the eroding trust into the government, and vice versa, the trust of politicians into their citizens. So this relationship of trust, for at least in Germany, I would say how we look at society here, that level with the government is very much part of, I think, fortunately, because we can still work with political actors on this issue. So in some countries, I think we have to get more fundamental to try to build up what has already been broken so much. But I think it's a lot about awareness and stepping back from your own perspective, because we all fall into the trap probably 25 times a day, I would assume. Just a wild guess.
Thank you very much for this first round. Just for you to know, we'll do a second round and then we open up. So no worries that we'll monopolize this. And you think I could have stayed at home with Zoom and it wouldn't have made or it would have made your life even nicer. But I want to get back to you. You said you talked about seductive simplicity and that you're no longer willing to talk to the other side in a sense.
Well, I am.
No, you are exactly, and I wanted to go, in a sense, how does it? Because you want to overcome this, and you've done this. You've worked with political forces in Hungary that want to move beyond, and how do you go about it? And are there any lessons or messages of hope? How it feels to try to be the one that reaches out and wants to talk to maybe some who don't want to talk to you and don't regard you as legitimate or as worth talking to.
So before I come to your answer, I just make some comment on both of you. So first of all, Natalie, you said that we have to go deeper. And of course, there are plenty of deeper reasons which we all, whichever country we live, we face together, is that we do live now in a vacuum. So all the changes that are around us are so deep and profound, and individually and by communities, countries, Europe, we all have to face this, and all these crises that we are going through now is demonstrating this very fragile situation that we are leaving behind an era, and we are going to another, hopefully, balance and not a global chaos by the climate change, the artificial intelligence, the migration, the globalization as such is a new modernization challenge for humanity. And many countries, and what we see, and when we see this very deep polarized countries which are already in this trap, and there are many in the world, from Turkey to India to the US, we can see how they are coming up, and Hungary is interesting because it is in Europe. Is one answer to this. I don't think it's a good answer, but it's basically ethnicization of life. It's kind of moving back to something that we know, we feel we know. It's avoiding the threat that we are facing about this big vacuum of how the future would look like. So I think that is the common thing, and the fragmentation, what you are witnessing practically in every country, is also a problem, because fragmentation means it's also a polarizing situation. It's not bipolar, but it means that the opinions are more diverse and further from each other. And this is just a question of a political leadership or time that someone is able to accumulate a number of groups, because Hungary was not a polarized country 15 years ago. It was made to be polarized. So this is why I say that these are many. So these seem to be very different circumstances, but they are actually reaction to the same challenge that we are facing. So of course, most of the efforts in countries where polarization is already very profound is this debate, the investment into human capital, basically to make people talk to each other, communities to talk to each other, citizenship education, critical thinking, media literacy, so that we can see the reality properly and understand the world in its reality. So the dialogue and bridging efforts are the main approaches. But the problem is that if you go to a political level, this is a different scale. And then this doesn't work. There are much stronger interests in the local community. You can try to bridge because actually people have to live together. So there is a very strong common interest. But how do you do it when it's in a political competition? And actually polarization is really beneficiary in these days. If you are tougher and stronger and radical, that means that you can make your tribe, this is a moral tribe, and that you are more stable. So that is a big issue. And the strategic dilemma here is that whether you want to depolarize and integrate forces which are polarizing, let's say AfD, well, what do we, or you want to delegitimize and isolate. So these are the typical questions we face. That do we invite AfD to a discussion, right? This is obviously, do we have to be tolerant towards the intolerant just because they are democratically elected? This is a real dilemma. Should the European People's Party exclude Fidesz because Fidesz doesn't fit, because it's intolerant, because it's destructive? These are bigger dilemmas than we think, and even if you can decide what to do, it's not very easy to do. So this is a problem with isolation and depolarization. Do you have to reciprocate? These are very aggressive forces. Even if they are small, they are super aggressive. They set their aggressive agenda on a political space. They force other groups, political parties, civil society to speak about migration. Let's say this is now the most appropriate. So how do you react? Are you pushing back? Because it is a war for them. They are playing a war, a death on life question. It's an existential question to them. So these are huge dilemmas, and this is what we don't know really the answer. And I don't think that actually there is very easy answer. We have tried, my political life in the last 6 years was all trial and error of all these techniques, you know? Do we have to be tough with them? Do we also have to speak on that very simplified, a very emotional, very nonsense language, what these forces bring to the political arena, or you try to be sophisticated and nuanced, and no one is listening to you. So these are the big issues. I think we basically have to know that this is a very severe, big issue. So that first of all, if we are aware that this is a war for many forces. They are not playing easy. They are really, really tough. But we don't want to play war because we want to live in a decent world. These are big questions of humanity. But that's what you have to tackle at political level. So I think that this is, whether this is, of course, at the end of the day, also if you look at the US or in Hungary, we do need institutional reform at the end of the day. We will have to reform political parties. Political parties are completely anachronistic in these days. They do not represent anything. Even German parties, they call themselves for ideological brand, but they are actually basically consumer tribes, right? We do have a lot of research about that. You probably also have some research how they don't represent values. They are using values for branding, but that's not really what political parties do in these days. This is why they can change so big. They can be this or that or whatever, because they do not really represent values in many countries. I mean, this is a media politics, branding politics, what is going on. So how to produce the environment that this deeper political reform would be possible. What is the role of the institutional organization? The European Union, which itself is suffering from the same problems. It needs institutional reforms. In the current form, it's completely inappropriate to manage all the problems that the EU should face. All the political actors leading, namely the nation state, the leaders of the nation state, are ready to give up more sovereignty, to do something more. And these are all go back to this question of polarization and whether we do understand that we are in the big picture, that we understand that we are in the middle of this big change, and how can we convince the people to follow us if we want to make reform? That these are all very complicated issues.
Yeah, thank you very much. Some controversial, I think, things you said on political parties. Maybe some in the audience want to pick this up. These are big topics. To bring it down again to maybe concrete steps, because I think, Natalie, in your first statement, you had a very kind of concrete description of this world of opinion makers, which in a sense is a democratizing thing, that no longer just an elite can have an opinion and make that heard. So in a sense we could say it's a positive thing, but you said if it defines your very identity, it gets this toxic kind of character. But how can we get to a situation? What could you imagine in terms of steps to take? Media, social media, individuals who you meant, in terms of making responsible use of the ability to communicate your opinion and to discuss with one another.
So on last Thursday, I took a plane for the first time in. I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself slightly, but it's
still exciting. Last
Thursday, I took a plane for the first time in almost 4 months. And I was at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, and I looked at I apologize if anybody's heard this story before, but I looked at the panel with all the flights announced. And I looked at it, and I was in Terminal 2F at Charles de Gaulle Airport, the only airport open in Paris at the moment. And I looked at the flights, and I saw that there were no flights coming into Europe from outside Europe, and there were no flights leaving Paris to anywhere outside Europe. All the flights were domestic, because Orly is closed, or European, and there were not very many people in the airport. And I suddenly had a feeling of how we know this, how our space can suddenly shrink, and how we can find ourselves in a bubble. And for me, it was on that screen, the list, I was looking for something that was perhaps just outside, just slightly outside Europe, and there was nothing. And I'm saying this because what we're doing here, and it made me think about actually even something like the Bosch Stiftung tries to do, and other foundations, which is to convene people. And we're meeting, have physically, have digitally. But the power of convening, I think, is clearly part of the answer to the problem that we're talking about. The power of convening people from across all sorts of boundaries, geographical, social, identity boundaries, educational, whatever, ethnicity. This is, the power of convening is something that we have to factor in as an element of the answer to what we're discussing, polarization. If polarization is the inability to even speak to one another. And as for the media organizations, my thought on that is that for somebody of the media scene of my generation, I started being a journalist in 1989, 1990. There are many blows. We are undergoing many blows. What drove us to journalism was to reveal things, explore the world, try to explain and understand. And I think that, in a nutshell, we have severe failures in recent years. I experience it this way. As a French European, I experience a failure of journalism and media organizations. And I'll just give 3 words for that, Brexit, Trump, and Gilets jaunes, to give just one example in my country. These are 3 massive phenomenons. Gilets jaunes as a formula to reflect, to describe the deep social disgruntlement in my country, France, which we have not seen the end of at all. Brexit, Trump, and Gilets jaunes, and perhaps many other manifestations in other countries that you know of. These phenomenons were not detected by the media. The social roots and the dissatisfaction and the sense of being unheard. People felt unheard. This was not addressed by the media organizations, many of which, I worked for beautiful, I continue to work for beautiful media organization. This is a thing that we have to think about much more, and especially in this digital world. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Laura, you said it's important to build trust again among those who no longer want to talk to another. Do you have some concrete ideas on how we could go about this in terms of formats?
Well, I think it's about sort of creating a level playing field, at least I'm speaking for Germany now, in society, because one of the main things that we found out about the fabric of German society addresses a little bit the point that you just ended with, that we said we have an invisible third in German society that does not engage with the political system because it just feels very distant to them. It's just not part of their upbringing or how they experience the world. And in the focus groups, you could almost touch it, that they said, yeah, you can vote every 4 years, but in between you can't do anything. And everybody that was watching behind the glass said, yeah, well, that's not true. Well, because we're not part of the invisibles. We have a very different relationship with the system. And so one part of our work really in Germany is right now focus on understanding these people better, because I think what I said earlier, when we talk about polarization, we think of a conflict, but I think it's about, and also what you said, Susanna, about doing the earlier work before it becomes the eruption or before it becomes a movement like the Gilets jaunes, to understand earlier, to have detectors, and to be honest about it. If our own organization is not that diverse, that it represents people from all walks of life and from these groups, then we need to find other ways to understand what's emerging. And I think that's when building trust starts, is to take people seriously, to also say, I'm not automatically a bad person just because I'm not intrinsically motivated to attend a roundtable discussion on democracy or polarization. That is totally fine. But I'm a citizen of this country and I have a place at the table, And I feel like, at least in Germany, I think these are necessary things to do. And so we, for example, will branch out, hopefully. It's not yet in writing, but what we want to do in the next year is I know this sounds crazy, to find out where in society actually different people meet. Where do we even overlap to make that convening possible? Because my experience is that all of us, or a lot of us, have understood this and want to do this, and we want people to have dialogue again, but we don't even have the knowledge of where we can actually do that. Which media partners would I even need to engage these people? There are great projects in Germany, like Germany Speaks is a project like that, but it's by Die Zeit, which is a liberal lefty party newspaper. So, I think we really need to change how we set up these things, and so they don't just work for us, they also work for other people. And then we can start building trust in these endeavors, but I think we need to do that work before.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open it up now to comments, questions that you may have. You were first, and please always wait for the microphone to come to you. That way we can make sure that you will be recorded for eternity. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Doug Saunders, a law professional upstairs. And I'm wondering what the panelists think in terms of as a tactic to prevent polarization, of the viability of the cordon sanitaire, of the notion that we should exclude parties and groupings that are beyond the moral pale from inclusion in politics, in media, potentially. I'm reminded that until the COVID crisis came along, the biggest thing happening in this country was that the cordon sanitaire had fallen apart in Thuringia and causing crises in two mainstream political parties. And I'm also reminded that in the United States, there had been a big debate in 2016 with the question of whether the extreme right fringe should be something that the media should treat as a legitimate part of politics or exclude as something that's a criminal problem or something like that, which fell apart when that extreme fringe took over the executive branch. And there's been a debate in recent months about whether that was a mistake to continue treating that form of politics as if it is legitimate, whether papers like the New York Times should hire columnists from that faction of politics to reflect the views of the administration and that sort of thing. And I think everywhere there's this idea that by getting rid of cordon sanitaires and allowing fringe parties to become part of the accepted dialogue when they get to a certain level of parliamentary representation or even power, are we reducing polarization, or are we creating a situation where the polarizers are being enabled by us and allowed to create even more polarization?
Thank you, Doug. It's a big question already. If anybody else wants to join the discussion, Elisabeth.
Thank you. My name is Elisabeth Hammerstein. I work for Körber Stiftung, mainly on European issues. And I'm also very delighted to be here, as it's my first event as well. And it seems very exciting, and I feel like I'm a bit socially awkward now because I don't know how to be around people who are not on Zoom anymore. I have two questions. One would be, I found the distinction between fragmentation and polarization very interesting, but I would be interested to hear a bit more about it, because to be honest, I was a bit surprised when you said that the UK is more on the fragmentation, not on the polarization side, which I guess is good news. But I wonder, how exactly do you distinguish between the two? And for Natalie, I have a question regarding the role of media, because you pointed out the different failures of media and how it resulted in Brexit, Trump, and the Gilets jaunes. But I wonder if you have any concrete ideas on where the media could help to avoid the polarization trap.
Thank you. We have the big question of the cordon sanitaire that also presents itself differently, I think, in Hungary very differently, because what we may think beyond the pale is actually in power there, so you cannot, the question poses itself differently. And then we have these two concrete questions. Maybe we start with you, Susa, on the cordon sanitaire. How would you approach that?
Well, actually, we also went through this debate, because in the 2000s, so this in the time that I just described at the beginning, an extreme far-right party was emerging in Hungary, Jobbik, and then back then it was a big issue what to do with this, and for several years. Media, for example, just completely neglected Jobbik and. They were not in politics yet, so they were not in a parliament yet, so it was a different status. But for example, there was no compromise between the mainstream parties, which Fidesz was a mainstream party back then, how to deal with that. And they made a very controversially politics, and because this was an interest for Fidesz to actually have a far-right party, and they just left this blurry the relationship. So it's I think I can see some kind of similarities in the dilemmas of the CDU sometimes when discussing the relationship with the AfD. And I talked to a number of people from CDU since I'm here in Berlin, and I could see a lot of differences that also by the profile of it as a dilemma, and also because there are different forces within CDU. There are more progressive, more liberal, there are more conservative, there are actually people who are very close to AfD, who regard AfD as a branch that split originally from CDU on the right, which then emerged or changed to something completely different. Well, my personal view is yes, I think that cordon sanitaire is super important. Even if political parties are elected, but it's only one thing. And the other thing is that you do have to provide an alternative to their voters. So until there is nothing else in Brandenburg or Thuringia, then they don't see lots of people who probably worried about this lag behind panic. There is this, what you described, the people who are not related to anyone, who are, how do you call it?
Invisibles.
The invisibles, right? A lot of people who do not feel represented, who do just feel themselves being in the periphery of the social arena. They are voters. They have exactly the same weight vote than any of us. And this is, for example, that Orban realized very easily, so that he can speak to people who are the invisibles. He can attract them very easily. Obviously, AfD can also do that. So until there is no a good alternative from the other parties, then the cordon sanitaires cannot really be efficient, because where else people can go? So I think there are always multiple strategies to be used. You cannot only have one thing. You do have to have provide a complex response to something which is such a difficult phenomenon.
Thank you. Laura, you had...
Can I add to that and then try to come to the technical or more technical question? So I think it's obviously that's a really tricky fine line to walk, and something that really struck me speaking for Germany when we did our focus groups last year. So just in general in German society, fairness is a really important value, or justice, you know. So people have a really strong sense of what is considered fair and what is not. And it was really interesting because that actually came out, even though we didn't ask for it, in the debate around the AfD and how it's being treated. So there, I think, is a fine line to walk to say that people say, I don't like the AfD, I didn't vote for them, but people voted for them, so you can't shut them out of everything. So I think there is a fine line to walk to not, so I'm in favor of the cordon sanitaire in terms of like who you give power to, but I think in terms of sort of procedures and all that, I think that you need to swallow some of the bitter pills. And I think it's a little problematic because our parliament is built on cooperation between the groups in the parliament, and that's where it's starting to sink a little. And I think the other mistake I see in Germany, I saw it this year, because another big thing that happened in Germany this year was Hanau, the anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim attack in Hanau. And what I found really fascinating is that a lot of political actors came out and said, this is the AfD's fault. And that is not true. You know, it's not that we have anti-Semitism and racism in Germany because of the AfD. And I think that's a little too, it's a cheap move, you know, to try to push them more over to the side. And I think so I think honesty there can help, you know, to draw a line, but also to be more self-critical, to hold it together in other regards. Getting to the fragmentation and polarization part is, I find it helpful to think of fragmentation because I feel that polarization often suggests an antagonism. And for example, in Germany, we do see groups that know who they are and they know who their enemy is and they stand opposite each other. And I actually think by now that social media doesn't just have the echo chamber effect, it actually has the effect that you know better who you're up against, you know, because you wouldn't really know this without social media or without the media as much unless you have it in your family or at your Stammtisch. So you know who you're up against, but they're actually people who are not part of that game at all. They're groups in society. And that's, for me, is more what the fragmentation goes towards. They don't even participate in the game. You know, it's not their thing. And I think we tend to forget that these people are there. And I think it's up for grabs whether they can be activated for a democratic society or whether they can be activated for other forces.
Thank you. You wanted to say something on the... Okay. Natalie.
Thanks. This is really, really good questions. On the cordon sanitaire, but perhaps just to... You're not talking about banning people from... Yeah, you're talking about how media hand the microphone to this or that group. Because in terms of banning political parties or banning a certain speech, there are laws, you know, different democracies will adopt a law that bans a certain party or bans hate speech. So that's a democratic process to have in terms of what the media or a media organization should do. I think, I mean, I remember in the 80s, in the mid-80s, when Jean-Marie Le Pen started emerging in France, there was an absolute cordon sanitaire among all of the kind of so-called mainstream or legacy media. Nobody would ever want to interview him. Now, hardly a day goes by without Marine Le Pen being on television, you know, on some... And I'm not saying that's wrong. It's just that our approach of this, clearly this question has shifted so much. My deeper answer is look at the root causes. And give a voice to those people who, you know, the voters. My answer would be absolute zero cordon sanitaire for giving the voters a voice. You need to hear the voters. The media have to go and see the voters. They have to understand why this is happening, and they should have done it much earlier. It's never too late. Also, we're speaking right now, we're in Berlin. I think this country is, maybe I'm wrong, but I think this country has less of a media problem than other countries. I mean, I know it's probably a long conversation, but it seems to me it's less polarized, it's less, you know, there's a healthy and strong public broadcasting and public interest. Of course, there's pluralism, and that's absolutely welcome, but it seems it's less toxic as a media environment.
We don't have no media problem, but we have less of a media problem.
Yeah, exactly.
But not
exactly.
no problem. That would be my...
No, exactly, no. So, I mean, you know, Zsuzsanna comes from a country there's a huge media problem. I mean, you know, and just to mention them, Index, an independent media organization, is under threat right now. I mean, literally, it's you know. So in countries where you have at least relative media freedom or fairly still preserved media freedom, the media organization should be going out and listening to those voters and documenting what exactly is creating these situations of polarization and disgruntlement. My short answer on how the media should approach this is there should be more diversity in media organizations. If we are all from the same social background, the same capital city, we're not going to be connected to what's happening outside the capital city and outside that social background. I think it's fundamental, and it's a strategy you need to develop. It's not easy, but we are in our bubble. And I think, and the second part of my answer would be, let's beware of a journalism that is defined by there is only one acceptable truth. And this goes to Doug's comment about should we have a columnist of, you know, saying different things. Let's beware of journalism that is based on there's only one acceptable truth. So you can have you can have, of course, opinions, and a newspaper or media organization can say, we are for this. You know, this is our stance. This is what we write. I'm on the editorial board. This is what we decide we want to say about this issue. But let's be aware that once you've said that, which is your freedom and perhaps your role, that in your journalism you are keeping that openness and that pluralism. There is not one single acceptable truth. I mean opinion and truth, right? So to very concretely, perhaps the New York Times shouldn't necessarily have a columnist that would just repeat what the language is of the Trump, press spokesperson, but perhaps it should have a columnist whose job is just to spend time in the flyover states among those communities and just describe that and be constantly telling us how this situation is playing out in Trump land, right? Not in New York or in other bubbles. And the same thing applies in Europe. Same thing.
We have to come to the networking part soon, but I want to open it. You wanted to make one point, but that's in the final. Save it for the final remark, and let's go back once, and then have a quick round, and then we're open. We're free to roam a little bit within the confines of social distancing, and you wanted to come in, Simon.
Yes, thank you. Simon Rinas from the Center of Advanced Internet Studies, research fellow there. We talked about, or you talked about inclusion a lot, because I was thinking about differentiating fake and facts, but when we talk about inclusion, I thought, did civil society somehow miss those people that feel not to be seen or not to be heard? Because when we look, there is a vivid civil society, at least when we talk about Germany, and I think also France and other countries, like sports clubs, neighborhood associations. But I guess that people that don't feel heard by society, they don't feel heard in their peer groups either, or they feel as if they could not speak up. And would like technologies or digital formats like online polling or discussion rounds online or even offline, like town hall meetings or something, would that rather intensify this divide, or could that be one part of a solution? So that is the question when thinking about solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Does anybody else want to come in? 1, 2, 3. Then
there are 2 more.
Oh, there's 2. Oh, I didn't. Sorry. It's very.
Thank you. I'm Jean-Christophe Bar with the Dialogue of Civilization Institute. I wanted to make a quick remark, or ask a question about this issue. Those who have been in a way tasked, to counter either polarization, radicalization, populism, have been mostly politicians and the media, who, for good or bad reasons, have been kind of badly discredited in the past decade or 2 decades and don't get much, let's say, impact in the public discourse. And my question, and in a way it is also related to what you said, is that the time maybe is come. First, I think we all agree that this issue of polarization is really becoming very, very high on the agenda, if not the main issue on the domestic and even international agenda. I was just participating yesterday, very interesting discussion with the UN on the reform of the international system, and there were many voices saying, well, the main risk for the world today is not the third World War III, but it's really the split within our, or the collapse of our societies that are profoundly divided. And in a way, this has not been really properly addressed so far. And my impression and in a way my conviction is that it is the time now for what we could call the connectors, those who have an audience, being arts, culture, business, really to jump in this discussion and to play their role, because they have much more, let's say, credibility and probably much more potential impact in touching the brain and touching the heart of the people.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Eng. I'm a former Bosch fellow, and I used to work for NBC in the States, so I survived the 2016 election. I just have a quick question about what you think is the upper limit for social media. For example, with Facebook, they now have a governance council. With Twitter, they're finally starting to mark things as perhaps inappropriate. So in the next year or so, how do you see, who polices who? Who makes the decision of what's wrong, what's right, what's fake? And especially when so many people are on social media now, even if they're silent and otherwise.
Thank you very much. Great comments, questions. One punchy final round. You pick and choose the question and the thought that you want to leave us with as we move into our networking phase. Maybe you want to start, Laura.
Okay, I can try.
Reverse order from the beginning.
Reverse order. Okay, we loop it back. Okay, I would try to tie this together. So I think in terms of let me start with the social media technology question, and sort of what you were getting at, whether it can make things worse or improve things. And I think my answer would be it depends. And it depends on whether you do it well, because to stay in tech lingo, I think we need a lot of more user-centered design in all of those formats. And the user can't just be people like me who are already interested in this stuff. It has to be people from the people we're trying to reach. So what you said, Natalie, we need to talk more with people and hear from them. And sorry, I'm like a broken record, but those focus groups, I never learned. It was a great privilege to sit in 14 hours of discussions, watching like in a behind the glass in 4 German cities last summer. I learned so much about my country just from that exercise, and so it's a great privilege that we can usually build that into our work, but I feel like that has to happen a lot more. We need to, if we want to achieve these goals, if we don't want our countries to sort of keep going down that route of what you unfortunately experienced in your home country, I think we need to get smarter, and we need to get a lot more strategic in how to address these. And to get to your point, I think that definitely needs to include other actors in society. I mean, businesses are large employers. They convene in normal times a lot of people at the workplace, and I think, especially in Germany, I think the business world has been sort of distant because everybody wants to be politically neutral, but I think if it starts to erode the norms of our society, you can't stay neutral anymore. And so I think we definitely need to have other actors, or also see them as part of this where fit.
Thank you. Natalie.
Microphone.
I don't see Facebook, personally I don't see Facebook and Twitter solve the problem, and nor should we rely on them. So as people who are living in Europe, we should be thinking about how do we build in Europe what we need, the infrastructure or the rules or the principles that make us able to weigh in the 21st century on how data is used, and how the way data is used respects human dignity and helps further and consolidate principles that we care about, democracy. And I think if we wait for any kind of counsel from Facebook or Twitter or anything like that to do that, we're not gonna. It's hopeless. I don't believe in that. I understand some of the individuals who take part in it, and but these are big beasts that have no interest whatsoever in their business model is about making us all addictive, and by creating polarization to enhance their dividends and their benefits. That's the reality. We know that. Just we've opened our eyes now to this. Cambridge Analytica, etc., etc. So I'm very critical, very, very critical, and I think the only way we address that is by creating our sovereignty in Europe on this question of digital and data. On your idea about culture, yes, definitely, yes. Of course, networks, connections, people, a lot of the people in this room are involved in that. My little nuance would be that this world is not suffering just from divisions and polarization within our democratic societies. It's also suffering from the dismantlement, absolute radical dismantlement of international rules that were set up after the Second World War by authoritarian regimes. I wanted to say that. And I think that question wasn't necessarily for me, but I support it.
We don't need anything. Okay, so I just come to the civil society issue, because of course I agree that the civil society can also reach those who are more part of the polity, or the more active part. That's easier to work with them, because they do organize themselves anyway. So this is a very, very important issue, I think, that brings civil society and politics together, which is very seen like this. But it's actually a very similar problem. Anyone who want to work for the betterment of society, that is an issue. Who do you work with? There is now a project in Hungary which is absolutely apolitical. It's called 1 billion trees. And this is that people are planting trees wherever they can, all over the country, and anyone can plant a tree. And then there's a big movement about 1 billion trees now. It's everyone showing how they planted it in their own garden, the park, wherever. I think that's super interesting. And we have to look for this kind of very simple ways how to integrate people together. So we might mobilize this for another purpose later. So it has 2 in 1, 3 in 1. We don't know how many in one reason, but there are ways to do this, but we do have to be consciously thinking about this. And just finally, going back to the fragmentation and the polarization, because fragmentation we do see practically in any countries. And how does it come to be so brutal? Like in Turkey, on the US, or in Hungary, it's really not a very big difference. It's just a political maneuver, how there is someone who believes that can make a political gain on bringing otherwise completely non-related issues together under a head. Let's say nationalism. So if you analyze how the Hungarian situation looks like in these days, then you can see that a real Hungarian is a man, it's straight, it's eating meat, it's reading, it's conservative. So things like have not much related to each other. These, why wouldn't you be a very diverse society? But then this is how the enemy is constructed. The enemy is based on gender, it's ideology, it's on ethnicity. It's a very racial compact. So this is how it's created, and it can be created anywhere. There is. As much we analyze the word countries, we see that this combo can put together by political will. So this is why we have to speak about. This is why we have to discuss it. My mantra is that a more global or a larger alliance is necessary between civil society, journalists, politics, business people, because we do basically face the big dilemma of whether we go to the global order or a global chaos. And there is no alliance at the moment on this side. I think there is no emerging alliance on the ethno-populist side, who can share a lot of experience through media use. I can tell hours about how Orban is sharing the experiences, but what I'd like to say that we have to look at very consciously, and obviously the task for politics, for civil society, for journalists, for hopefully business too, is to provide another narrative beyond the national narrative that can bring more people in common. Probably. So what goes beyond us, what's bigger than us, what can bring together, because actually this is our common challenge.
Thank you very much. I think you set us up beautifully by choosing this topic for the relaunch of the dialogues here at Robert Bosch Stiftung and the Bosch Academy, because it was clear that we couldn't possibly do justice to the topic and exhaust it, but it would trigger lots of follow-on discussions. And what I think in all of us that we take with us and ideas is almost like the overarching theme of what we need to tackle at all sorts of levels. We talked about the local, very local level, I think in local politics to do this. Also at the workplace, that's one idea of More in Common, that actually in larger workplaces, there's diverse people coming together on every day. Why don't we use that for these kind of formats to talk, foster discussions among those who wouldn't otherwise necessarily talk to one another about political issues. At the national level, at the European level where there's polarization, and at the global level. These are all the levels that a foundation and a convener like the Bosch Stiftung and many others who are in this business work at. And I think we got lots of ideas on how to do it, how not to do it. I think one good metric is if it doesn't involve difficult trade-offs, and if it doesn't feel unpleasant at times, you're not doing it right. I think that's because we have quite a bit of work ahead of us. And thank you to our wonderful panelists and to all of you who came, shared your ideas, and I think we all now have the task to kind of take it to our organizations and our work as citizens, and to make the most out of it, because I think we can say with quite a bit of certainty that in a year from now we won't say, okay, this was the topic of 2020 and we've overcome this. This is bound to stay with us. Thanks again to all the organizers who helped, and enjoy the rest of the event and your afternoon. Thanks for coming.